welcome to another episode. I'm joined by a good friend of the show and the founder of the Public Safety Foundation, Rory Geoghegan. Rory, welcome to the show. How are you, first of all?
Now, I'm very well and delighted to be here, not least with our most esteemed guest.
Indeed. So, when I look at policing through the times, there's three big policing brands around the world that I reflect on. The Met, obviously, for us here in London. But when you look across the water to our brothers and sisters in law enforcement in the US, there are two departments that I think that are probably the most iconic. That's the NYPD and the LAPD. And we're incredibly honored to be joined by a gentleman who has run both departments, whose life has been devoted to policing and supporting men and women on the front line, even in a post-policing career. And it is a great honor to welcome Commissioner Bill Bratton onto the podcast. Commissioner Bratton, thank you for being on the show. And how are you?
I am very well, Oliver. Thank you for having me on the show. A special shout out and thank you to Rory for helping to put this together. Listening to your opening comment about iconic police departments, there are three in the world from my perspective. Certainly New York and LA that I'm intimately familiar with. But thirdly, the Metropolitan Police in London. Those three entities are probably the most fabled, most storied, and most often seen on movies and television about police. And I came very close to having a trifecta in terms of David Cameron, when he was prime minister, had presented an opportunity to potentially come over as head of the Met, but the law at that time precluded anybody that was not a citizen of the Commonwealth from taking that position. I think it's subsequently been changed, but I'm a little too old to contemplate it. And but it was fun to contemplate when it was happening.
And that's a remarkable part of your career, which we'd like to explore a little bit later on the show, because it is a very interesting segment in terms of a British Prime Minister reaching out overseas at what was quite a turbulent time for the Met in 2011, which we'll come to shortly. But I like every good detective, I like to start my podcast at the start of people's careers. And I suppose the first question I've got for you, Commissioner Bratton, is why were you drawn to policing? What was those first steps into the vocation all about for you?
I joined policing in 1970 at the age of 23. I was very significantly influenced in the 1950s growing up by television. Television at that time in its infancy featured very prominently police stories on television, including in our country, Dragnet Badge 714, featuring the, excuse me, fabled LAPD, Naked City, featuring the NYPD, even shows of humor. Car 54, Where Are You? About two bumbling New York City police officers, or Barney Miller about a squad of detectives. And then along came One Adam 12 for those two handsome cops, Reed and Malloy. I got to meet both of them when I was chief of the Los Angeles Police Department. And I also lived just 2 blocks away from the local police station in my neighborhood, which was housed in an 1890s building. And the other half of that building was the Boston Public Library, where I spent my time. I'm an avid reader of history. And I was very fortunate that to live in proximity to that police station. And see a book early on in my life called Your Police. It was a illustrated book about the New York City Police Department in the 1950s. I was fascinated with that book, and it was a phenomenal influencer. As I got a little older and began to read more mature material,
Mhm.
there was another book called The Commissioner by Richard Daughtry, which was about a police commissioner in the city of New York and the issues he was facing at that time in the early 1960s. It was subsequently made into a wonderful movie, I think one of the best police procedural movies ever made, called Madigan, starring Henry Fonda as the police commissioner and Richard Widmark as a first grade detective. That movie and book, and I have a copy of both, were, I think, the more significant influences of my desire to someday, as far-fetched as it seemed, to become police commissioner in New York City as a young kid growing up in Boston. But dreams do come true sometimes, and fortunately mine did.
We talk about throughout the series often families' response and friends' response to joining a vocation which can often concern friends and families, as sort of, what does this mean for us in terms of, will you be watching what we drink at the bar? You know, how was the response from friends and family, mum and dad, brothers and sisters, when you announced this desire to join the police and to get into law enforcement? Were they receptive of that desire?
Very receptive. That I have no family that were in or currently are in American policing. The influences were the ones I previously discussed. But back in the day, the idea of becoming a police officer was one of stature, was one of prestige in the United States. And so it had the support of my family, friends, and colleagues. Policing in America, as has been the case in your country, has been a bit of a roller coaster ride. It has its ebbs and flows, its ups and downs in terms of how it's viewed by the public. For a recent period of time, 2020, my country, after the murder of George Floyd, policing went into a significant tumble down. But fortunately, it's now started to come back up again in stature. But when I joined back in the 1970s, there was nobody that were opposed to my seeking that position.
So going through Boston, which is where you cut your teeth in policing in the 70s, what was that like in terms of, often I'm very intrigued as to sort of how young officers are able to cope with the challenges that policing presents them, because the training that you go through is one thing, but there's nothing like being out operationally and having to deal with sudden and unexpected trauma, often sudden death and violent crime scenes. How did you adapt to those challenges, both emotionally and physically, and being able to sort of compartmentalize those elements of stress which you're presented with quite regularly?
The first several years of my policing career were one of great disappointment. I was on the streets of Boston after 8 weeks of training in the police academy, just 8 weeks, with my 6-shot revolver, 6 spare rounds and loops on my belt, a whistle, a ticket book, a badge, patrolman 1190. There were no police women in the Boston Police Department until 1976, wow. 6 years later. I still have that badge. They didn't change that to police officer until 1986. And the policing world I entered was one of corruption, brutality, racism, incompetency, and very poor leadership. And that was the Boston Police Department. And I'm not sure that much more could be said about policing nationally at that time in my country. Fortunately for me, however, as I was considering leaving the Boston Police Department to go to a suburban police department, hoping I might find a better situation, an individual came onto the scene who changed my life and has changed it for the now next 50 years. And that was Robert Di Grazia. Bob Di Grazia came from another police agency. He was brought in as the Boston Police Commissioner in 1972 or 73 by Mayor Kevin White, who was trying to deal with the corruption and the brutality and the incompetence. And he was brought in as a change agent and a transformational change agent, and he was one. I have since modeled my career after him in the sense of the changes that he brought about so quickly in the Boston Police Department. And he changed my life. 2 examples. He presented the opportunity for young police officers to join a number of committees that he had formed to begin the change of the police department, because he understood the importance of not just creating change from the top, but creating it from bottom up. So I found myself volunteering for a rules and regulations committee to rewrite the rules and regulations of the Boston Police Department. 2 years on the job, and I'm serving on committees with basically the chief of patrol, chief of detectives, people who've been on the job 35 years. And so I had early on exposure to opportunity. The second change that he made was one that profoundly impacted my career and professional life, that he changed the promotional process. To get promoted in the Boston Police Department was largely a matter of seniority and memorization of what was called the Blue Book, which were the rules and regulations and the laws that we had to deal with. And as a result, the average age of a sergeant in the Boston Police Department at that time was in the 50s. The average age of a police officer, interestingly enough, was close to 40.
Wow.
And so myself at age 23, looking ahead that it might take me 17 more years to make the rank of sergeant was not particularly exciting. But what Di Grazia changed was the civil service process, where he made it a multi-part examination that you had to study in addition to the rules, regulations, and laws of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. He brought 6 books that had to be read and understood and tested upon, including managing patrol operations, managing investigation procedures, race and relations in the United States, the Kerner report on the riots that occurred, the race riots in the 1960s. And then the exam process was not just a written exam, it then consisted of an oral exam and an assessment center. Unheard of. But as a result of that, I studied like crazy. I decided to stay with the Boston Police Department. And as luck would have it, I came in #1 on the promotion process for sergeant. And I was promoted along with 80 of my colleagues, including many who, like myself, had been on the job 5 years or less. And that really jump-started my career. Within 10 years of joining the Boston Police Department, I was the superintendent in chief. I was the highest ranking uniformed officer in the department, reporting directly to the civilian police commissioner. So I had a meteoric rise as a result of the intercession of Bob Di Grazia in his transformational leadership of the Boston Police Department. By way of training example, upon promotion, formerly, sergeants would report to the property clerk's office, get a brown envelope, which would contain their badge and their appointment letter, and then be sent out to their assignment. No additional training.
Wow.
Grazia changed that. There was a formal promotional ceremony that with all the hoopla. And then you went off for 3 weeks to Boston University for training with some of the top professors, criminologists, and academics in the country. At that time, there weren't many of them, 1975, because what was missing from the police profession in America, unlike your own country with the Met and the standardization, was a body of knowledge, was much research, there really wasn't much about policing. Most police chiefs did not have college educations. I think in the senior leadership of the Boston Police Department in the 70s, there were fewer than half a dozen of the senior leaders that had college degrees. So what effectively Di Grazia was all about was changing everything. He turned the world literally upside down, and he's been my role model. He also presented an opportunity that helped to shape my career for the next 50 years, and that was exposure to you, the British Police Services, the Met. I think it was Sir Mark, it might be Phil Marks, I'm not sure what the Sir Mark's first name was. He was the police commissioner. What is it? Robert Marks. And so I was invited as a young sergeant to a meeting with the visiting British Police Commissioner in Di Grazia's office. And in that meeting, he talked about and produced a copy of Sir Robert Peel's 9 Principles of Policing. That was my first exposure to what eventually would become the platform that I've stood on ever since, and the 9 planks of that platform. If you read it today, and I encourage every time I give a speech, a talk, a teach, a lecture, I distribute it, because it is more poignant, more significant today, the language, than it was back in 1829 when it was promulgated. And so that was my first exposure to another, if you will, pedestal that upholds the platform I stand on.
I mean, look, it's fascinating to hear just how transformative exposure to one individual can be in terms of the opportunity they can provide and that sort of door they open. And I guess in terms of sort of Boston, you progressed, as you say, to like that kind of the highest sort of levels, and then sort of what caused you or took you towards New York, or what took you sort of out of Boston, as it were?
I had always had a yearning for the LAPD, NYPD, going back to, again, childhood, and those influences continued into the 70s, because 70s and 80s, many of the shows on television continued to be centered around those departments. Chicago to a lesser extent, but Chicago has never risen to the iconic stature of the other two. And then I had the opportunity, through travel and educational opportunities, to visit Los Angeles, visit New York, other cities around the country. And it was ironic visiting them. It was like the Wizard of Oz, the curtain opened, and they were quite not what I expected. That in terms of there was an image that had been projected by television for 20 years, and particularly an image that Chief Parker of the LAPD had attempted to project of this extraordinarily professional, incorrupt, not corruptible police organization. When I got to Los Angeles in 1980 for my first visit of that Story Police Department, I was amazed at how much so few officers were doing in that very troubled city. And this was shortly after the creation of 911 in our country. I forget what the code is that you have, the 3-digit code in the British Isles.
Yeah.
But 911 was the monster that consumed American policing. We just could not keep up with the volume of calls. In the storied LAPD, in the year I visited, 1980, they had not responded to 1 million calls for service. That's how far behind they had fallen, that they had no capacity to keep up with the calls for service. And their equipment was incredibly dilapidated. Their police stations were a mess. And then visits to New York City found the same thing, that just bureaucracies from the 1940s trying to wrestle with the issues of the 1980s. So it was eye-opening in the sense of the facade that had been created versus the reality.
And did they feel very much sort of in a tougher spot than the Boston Police Department you knew? Kind of, because you spoke earlier about how, you know, you landed in Boston and you were kind of a little bit disappointed in some ways at the beginning. Kind of, did you see those challenges in those other places and sort of feel like, bring it on, I kind of want to kind of chart a path through those places, turning them around, or had that not yet formed?
I think as I look back at that time, that leadership of those departments, I think, were aware of their shortcomings, many of which they attributed to budgetary issues. That American policing in the 1970s, ironically, we just recently had the defund the police movement in 2020 in this country. We're still recovering from the effects of that. But what's not remembered is how bad the 1970s were for American policing. And George Kelling writes brilliantly about it, my colleague, mentor, the late, great George Kelling, that he writes about the 3Ds. George and I both try to keep things to threes. So the 3Ds were in America at that time: decriminalization, deinstitutionalization, and depolicing. Let me briefly explain, because it was the state of American policing, and I don't care which police department you're in, Boston, New York, Chicago, they're all going through the same issues. Decriminalization, many of the laws we had come to work with were taken away. That in terms of public drunkenness was no longer a crime. It was deemed to be an illness. So you had to deal with it very differently than the old ability just to arrest for it and the disorderly conduct that often went with it. Many of the other minor crimes were now made offenses rather than crimes, diminishing the ability of the police to enforce those rules and ordinances. So decriminalization was playing a role, plus in many respects a tightening up of procedures by which the police had to operate. The Miranda, stop, question, and frisk. So many of the controls over policing, because of our abuse of the law, those were tightened up in the 70s. So that further diminished the powers of the police in an effort to professionalize the police. The irony of that in terms of, but they were much needed and have basically borne great fruit since that time. So depolicing, and Boston is a case in point. 2,800 officers when I joined that department in 1970. Only 55 Black officers and no women. 1980, as superintendent of that department, we went through a budgetary crisis, as many departments were going forward. And I had to lay off 25% of the department as it stood at that time, which was at 2,172 officers, down from 2,800. Wow. We went down from a period of 6 months down to 1,544. Think of that, almost a 50% reduction in the size of that police department. We closed half the police stations, got rid of the police museum, the harbor patrol, the mounted unit. And I had to try and convince the public in Boston we're going to police them better with All of that no longer there. So that was
Mm.
defunding of the police. And New York City went down to 19,000 police officers for a period of time, in that period of time. And some officers in that department were laid off for years before they were brought back. So we had decriminalization, depolicing, and depolicing not only with fewer police, but the way police to deal with that shortage of personnel. But it's thought to be a good thing at the time. We became more mechanized. Automobiles were introduced in a big way. I started walking a beat, but within a short period of time, I was in a car. And the vehicle was thought to be great. You could cover much larger distances, respond more quickly. It would require fewer officers to cover larger areas. But what we began to do was lose contact with the citizens. So the depolicing effectively took us away from contact with the neighborhoods. Then in 1978, when we got air conditioning, we could roll the windows up and be even further away from the public. So, no, all these little things in terms of
Wow.
mechanization was all thought to be modernization, if you will.
Yeah.
And even 911 was thought to be this great thing. They'd put a dime in the phone and you could reach the police, and then they basically could make a call for free. And boy, did that really create a burden upon the police. So we got decriminalization, depolicing, with fewer police on the streets. But then the third one that really is being felt today in your city and my country, homelessness, deinstitutionalization. Hundreds of thousands of poor souls led out of terrible conditions that were like imprisonment for the mentally ill. And the country is going to spend a fortune on smaller facilities in neighborhoods, at-home treatment, et cetera. It didn't happen. The money was never spent. So what did we create on the streets with fewer police officers, with fewer laws to work with? We created the homeless issue that is still problematic to this day and growing. And that homeless population was besieged with not only the mental issues, but were very susceptible to the drug problems that were now emerging significantly. And the 70s were a time of phenomenal erosion in our society. And a good example of when policing loses its tipping point capability, where it tipped backwards. It took 20 years for us to get back in the game again. And I predict now in the 2020s that we're into now, cities like New York, et cetera, it's going to take New York 5 to 10 years to recover from the malaise that it's currently in.
We look back at your career, Commissioner Bratton, and in 1990, if I've got my dates right here, you moved into the position of transit police chief at a time when people were fearful of the subways, crime was high, and you came in and immediately identified these significant issues and really almost took policing back to its basics in terms of policing sort of the small crimes that you would inevitably believe would lead to bigger crimes in terms of people that were fare evading, often maybe carrying knives, were wanted on warrants. What was that like for you stepping into that first quite significant role in a significant city facing incredible challenges to try and understand what was important for you now and the department?
This is reflective of the first of Sir Robert Peel's 9 principles and includes the 5 most important words in policing, whether in your country, mine. The basic mission for which the police exist is to control crime and disorder. Control crime and disorder. In America, we stopped dealing with disorder. We focused on just serious crime. And what we didn't recognize, and this is where Kelling understood it brilliantly, in both a wonderful article with Jim Wilson, 1982, Broken Windows. I was living that in the 70s as a young lieutenant in Boston in a neighborhood policing program, one of the first of its kind in the country, where I'd go into neighborhoods armed to the teeth with community meetings with all my crime stats. But the public, interestingly enough, in even those crime-ridden areas, focused more on quality of life, or the so-called broken windows. And what was that? The graffiti, the prostitute, the drug dealing, the abandoned car, city services that were not keeping their neighborhoods clean and safe. And why do they focus on that? Because that's what they experienced every day. So what we thought were victimless crimes, many of the crimes that we no longer were enforcing, there was a victim. It was the neighborhood. We were victimizing not one individual with a crime. We were victimizing dozens, hundreds, thousands. And I was very fortunate very early in my career, within my 10 years of starting in policing, I understood and recognized that, and that has shaped and formed me for the last 40 years of leadership. And then when Kelly and Wilson wrote about it so brilliantly, I had much the same as Sir Robert Peel's 9 principles. I now had another plank to put on the platform to stand on. And I have stood on that platform despite a lot of resistance and a current fervor in this country against broken windows, quality of life policing, with the idea that it seems to impact mostly on minorities, minority communities. Why does that happen? Largely minority communities, because many of those communities, unfortunately, are very poor. And they're the neighborhoods that have more of those problems than many other neighborhoods. And so it'd be totally negligent not to respond to those concerns. But it's a subject of great debate. And I just actually took out of my file an article that I wrote with George Kelly just before he passed away. Because George was, in some respects, brokenhearted that the principles of broken windows policing were being attacked as racist, that they were things that police should not be doing. You expect police not to want to deal with prostitution, narcotic stealing, graffiti, vandalism, all those minor crimes. Who's going to deal with it if the police don't? The challenge for us is three things done in a series of threes. You have to police constitutionally. In our country, we have a constitutional system. You have common law in yours. You have to police consistently. Poor neighborhoods, rich neighborhoods, you have to police the same, and you have to police compassionately. You have to be conscious you're dealing with people. So the idea of 1990 going to New York, I was standing on the principle that I recognized that serious crime had to be dealt with and could be dealt with, but it could not be dealt with to the exclusion of dealing with broken windows, because like weeds in a garden, if you don't weed a garden, they will kill the strongest oak tree. And all of those fare evasions in the subway, the 5,000 homeless people trying to live in the subway, the vandalism, the minor crime, that's what those 3.5 million people who rode the system every day saw, and that's what created fear. And we went after it right at the beginning, and something that had not been dealt with for 25 years. And no wonder that within 2 years, we made the subway safe. The subways became much safer than the streets of New York, and continued to be for 25 years until the legislature and the city council in this country went crazy and began to go in an opposite direction, where they effectively took away the criminal components of many of these issues, and once again tried to make them subject of civil law, and thus reduce the ability of the police to deal effectively with them.
It's a real challenge, I think, at the moment for police departments, both in the US, but also I think in the UK, actually, to a degree, of trying to get into those kind of, the quality of life crimes and disorder that we have just spoken about. I think often good cops out there working hard, dedicated, doing the best they can to improve public safety in their neighborhoods, find themselves let down by the sort of the wider system. And I suppose I don't know whether you felt any of that back when you were turning the NYPD round the first time, or whether this is a sort of a new challenge for the police.
It was all welcomed in the early 1990s politically. A lot of political support for it, legislative support for it, a lot of support among minority communities, because those are the communities most dramatically affected by disorder and crime. In your country, which I started visiting with some regularity in the 90s, and saw many of the same issues in your country that the police were dealing with, that there was a effort to deal with it because you had the foundation of Robert Peel's principles, and that was the whole idea of the Bobby on the beat, by his presence, his or her presence, to prevent these things from happening. Remember, to prevent crime and disorder. So you already had that as a foundation, and that your frustration in turning the century into the 21st century was the misguided defunding of your police in the period 2010, 11, 12, 13, the creation of the commissioner system, that you reduce your police forces by about 25%. You're still trying to recover from that debacle. And that, so in some respects, what happened in America in the 1970s, you experienced in 2010 in your country. And you closed Brams Hill, one of the foremost training institutes of policing anywhere in the world. You closed it. In terms of, yeah, I scratch my head sometimes when I think of the things that went on in your country. That there's an expression I have at the beginning of my most recent book, The Profession. Those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. Those who know police know they don't know their history. Well, I'd say the same thing about government. Those who know government understand that government oftentimes doesn't know their own history.
Can I ask a question, Commissioner Bratton, in terms of one of the greatest challenges of as a very senior leader and the leader of any policing organizations is managing the expectations of those political posts in terms of those that you're accountable to and you report to. How did you manage those relationships, manage expectations, and often deal with conflicting priorities around budgets? Was that a task for you? Is it something that you resented? Is it something you embraced? How did you navigate that often quite complex environment?
One of the things that must be realized is that police leadership, commissioners, superintendents, police chiefs, probably spend the majority of their time dealing with the political establishment. That may seem like a kind of foolish statement on my part, but I've headed up the two largest police departments in America, two of the largest, and that led a number of other departments. And I think back the amount of time I had to spend on the political aspects of the job. Politics, dealing with politicians, but politics internally, politics within the organizations I was a part of, city government. And my second book is entitled Collaborate or Perish, that if you don't collaborate in today's network world, you're going to perish. The collaboration oftentimes is very difficult. The idea of trying to win people over to your ideas and your thoughts, and it's not easy. And what's not fully understood, I think, in picking a police chief, for example, is that no two cities are exactly like. London is oftentimes compared with New York. There are many similarities, but they're two different patients. And police chiefs, in some respects, are like doctors, that they have to look at each patient separately. That you have tall people, short people, you have fat people, small people. You have London, England. You have New York, New York. They are very different cities, although they are oftentimes compared. Very different populations, similar issues, but it's like a doctor. The skill is, how do you use the medicines that you have to work with? How do you use the technology to help you make the diagnosis of every patient is different? And that's the reality of it. So similarly, in dealing with politics, each city that I have policed in has been different. And it's a matter of understanding the politics of the community you're in. One of the great difficulties in New York right now for my successor, 4 times removed, the current police commissioner, is that the city council that he works with and tries to get a budget from, the state legislature, which creates many of the laws in the state and the city, they have moved so far to the progressive left that trying to work with them is extraordinarily difficult, because they have a great dislike and disdain for the NYPD. And I would argue that he has a tougher time than I did back in the 1990s, when the political establishment was so concerned with the terror of the 70s and 80s. They were willing to work with some of the ideas I had at that time. My successors have not had that same luxury. That is, the politics have moved to the left, and crime and disorder have gotten worse over the last couple of years. The ability to turn it around, like I was able to do back in the 90s, that's the title of my first book, Turnabout. The ability to turn the situation around here it's like going into a minefield on a pogo stick blindfolded. That you never know when you're going to bounce on a mine. And what I'm talking about is, you never know which politician you're going to end up upsetting, because there's so many different viewpoints and perspectives now. Trying to get consensus, which is one of the principal jobs of a police chief, is extraordinarily difficult today.
One area that I'm keen to sort of understand about your commissionership at the NYPD. So you took up that position in January of 1994, and I think, I don't know if you'd agree with this statement, in terms of that you were probably an outsider of that organization. You hadn't sort of organically climbed up through the NYPD. How important was it for you, when you took the reins of such a formidable organization, for you to build such a strong and successful team around you? Because in the sort of the corporate world, an entrepreneur always say, if I'm the cleverest person in the room, I'm getting out that room. How important for it was you in a policing sense to build a strong team that you could rely on to execute your plan?
That it is absolutely critical, but it's also part of the fun of being the new commissioner, the new police chief. I've purposely chosen assignments where I was going to have great discretion in creating my leadership team. And in some respects, as a chief of police, new commissioner, that you're like a wedding planner, something old, something new, something bold, something blue. So going into the NYPD, and I'd had the luxury of being chief of the New York City Transit Police Department in that city. So I was able to kind of study it for almost 2 years as a collaborator with that organization. So I knew a lot of its strengths and its weaknesses. So when I say something new, me, and some of the people I brought in with me, something old, I kept a significant number of the people that are already there. Something blue, I kept police leaders, but I also brought in civilians in significant positions of leadership as consultants. So much the same as Bob Di Grazia did back in 1973 in Boston. He had 5 outsiders he brought in because the talent to turn that department around did not exist. So he brought in 5 whiz kids, if you will, outsiders who had significant personnel experience, who had significant managerial experience, significant technological experience that the department itself did not possess. One of those whiz kids, Bob Wassman, has been probably the most significant mentor, colleague, friend in my 50-year career. Brought Bob with me everywhere I've ever gone. He's brought me oftentimes to places he's gone. For example, we worked together for TfL in London, Transport for London, when Bob Kiley was the general manager there. One of the things we created for TfL was the idea that the Metropolitan Police would supply a large number of police officers to deal with TfL issues, and we comp-statted it. So the idea of building a leadership team is the fun of it. And I'm very good at building Super Bowl teams. Every place I've gone, I have succeeded for a significant period of time because of the team I surrounded myself with. And your comment about you don't want to be the smartest person in the room. You want to have a lot of people who are a lot smarter than you on a lot of issues. And I surround myself with very smart people, but those very smart people sometimes don't like each other. And I liken it to being a ringmaster with circus with tigers, lions, and bears. If left to themselves, they'll kill each other. And so one of the strengths of being a team leader is understanding how do you get the performance out of that individual that you want and blend it into the overall performance of the department. And something that, again, Bob Di Grazia possessed it. The issue that Bob fell down on was that he never got along with his union. He had the unfortunate experience of dealing with the first organized union in the history of the Boston Police Department that hated management. Because management had abused it for 100 years. So when they're birthing, as they're starting to feel the muscles and flex the muscles, Di Grazia coming in flexing his muscles, you had 2 people basically wrestling each other to death. And I watched that happen. So one of the entities I work with very carefully are my unions. I've never had a vote of no confidence from a police union, despite bringing great changes to organizations. Have we had differences of opinion? We have had differences of opinion, but I try to never let it become personal. So there's multiplicity of skill sets that are necessary to be a successful leader in policing 50 years ago, 30 years ago, and in contemporary policing today.
And one of the individuals who I don't feel is often heard enough about here in the UK, I think, but who kind of runs through sort of turnaround and the New York experience, certainly, like kind of, fundamental to the DNA of that turnaround, I think, was Jack Maple. I don't know whether you might be able to shed a little light on how you met Jack, how perhaps you persuaded him or otherwise to join the team, and kind of, from my recollection anyway, he went from being kind of, very much a frontline sort of, crime fighter to being kind of one of the core of the top team within fairly short order. And just a little bit of that journey would be fascinating to hear.
One of my skills as a police leader is the recognition of talent and recognizing it in odd locales and locations. Coming into the transit police in New York City, 1990, as I was meeting the leadership of the department and then meeting various heads of units, there was a robbery squad that also contained a decoy unit that these were officers who would dress up in various disguises and go out in the system and attempt to be robbed. And then it'd be basically support officers who'd be there to help make an arrest. The head of that unit was Jack Maple, who may be not known to a lot of your audience, but Jack was at that time a lieutenant in the transit police, not a significant rank, but he was the leader of the squad. He was kind of looked down upon by the senior leadership of the department and by many in leadership in government, in public safety government in New York City. And one of the reasons they kind of looked down on Jack was that Jack really felt that something could be done about crime, that he had some ideas about how to deal with it. And they kind of foo-fooed him. They kind of just pushed him off. Part of it was his visible appearance. Jack was a short, 5'8", 230-pound, looked like a sumo wrestler. And style of dress, he wore a derby, two-tone shoes, bow tie, double-breasted blazer. He cut quite a figure. And so he was a bit of an oddity. And he was, in conversation, he was a New York Demendoz type of guy. He had a real strong Brooklyn accent. And so among the elite, the educated, the advanced, that Jack was not accepted. I immediately recognized in Jack, when I met him, his brilliance on the issue of crime. One reason being that much of what he was espousing echoed what I had come to learn over the previous 30 years about how to deal with crime. The idea of mapping it. I had huge maps in my office in the 70s where I would pinpoint the growing problem, hotspots. Jack was doing the same thing in transit police. So in some respects, looking at Jack, that we look nothing at all alike, but I found a mirror image in terms of ideas and concepts. And again, he was much smarter than I was about transit crime. I've been a transit cop for 20 some odd years. And there were others, Mike O'Connor. And so I created a Super Bowl team in transit, people who did not necessarily get along with each other. But Jack was just brilliant on the issue of crime. And criminologists hated him because he had no use for criminologists. They had no use for him. And one of the reasons was he was successful. His ideas worked. And so when I went to Boston, back to Boston, I brought Jack with me. But Jack missed New York, as did I. And then when the opportunity to become Giuliani's commissioner presented itself in '94, both of us went back. And I moved Jack up to the position of Deputy Commissioner for Crime Control Strategies. And along with others in the department, most of my leadership team had been promoted from the lower level of chiefs in the NYPD. There's a 4-star structure of chiefs in the NYPD, 4-star being the chief of department, then 3-star, 2-star. Most of my leadership team came from the 1-star level, including John Timoney, who was moved up from 1-star to 4-star chief of department. Louis Anamone from 1-star chief to 3-star chief of patrol. Anamone became Maple's partner, and the two of them basically developed the concept of CompStat, which resonated with me because it's all about mapping crime, where it was occurring, rapidly responding to it. But it was also about accountability. This idea that you had to have a system where you could hold people accountable for crime. And how do you hold them accountable? By measuring, do they know anything about it? If it's up, why is it up? If it's down, why is it down? What are you doing that's working? What are you doing that's not working? And something I'm a great believer in, this collaboration is essential to everything I do, is inclusion. And that's where CompStat, that system, was not only about the mapping of crime and the timely, accurate intelligence, rapid response to it, effective tactics, but inclusion, getting everybody into a room to talk about it, from going back to my days as a young cop in Boston, being able to work on the Rules and Regulations Committee with the chiefs, basically having detectives in the room with the super chiefs, talking about crime, all of them hearing about it, sharing ideas. And so what CompStat in its inception and what it eventually became and embraced so significantly around the world, it was understood by police that we finally had something that worked. And also what changed was that we were being willing to be held accountable for crime, going up or going down. 70s and 80s in my country, nobody held the police accountable for crime going up or down because nobody believed that the police could really do anything about it. They thought that crime was caused by poverty, racism, the weather. Crime is caused by criminals. And so to focus on crime like a doctor trying to focus on cancer, you go to where the cancer is. And the cancer are the criminals. The challenge is to make sure that as you go after the criminals, you don't harm the innocent. And that's the challenge for policing. And so Maple was just brilliant. And I guess what I provided was the soothing of egos that all these academics and politicians who had foo-foo Jack for years, now all of a sudden he's their equal. And in many respects, they're superior because his ideas worked and theirs did not.
Superb.
Between 2002 and 2009, Commissioner Bratton, you took over as the chief of the LAPD, another, as we've already mentioned, iconic international law enforcement department. But prior to 2002 and 2009, a new emerging threat had appeared on the radar of police forces across the world as a result of probably one of the most, all for the wrong reasons, symbolic terrorist event, 9/11. I wanted to sort of ask you, how did that impact you in terms of your law enforcement methodologies around fighting crime? Then suddenly this thing called terrorism appearing, which had been around in spats, but never been on US soil. When you took over the LAPD in 2002, was counterterrorism suddenly something that was on your radar that you had to acknowledge and understand that had become of the police's ability to respond to in a modern day policing force?
In the British Isles, unfortunately for you, because of the Irish troubles, that you had been experiencing terrorism on a great significant scale for 30 years. So it was not new to you other than the scale that 9/11 presented. It was new to American policing that you'd have to go back to the 1920s when you had the anarchists blowing up around the country on a scale similar to what you experienced with the Irish and the Troubles. But policing is constantly evolving, and sometimes the evolution is so significant it's revolutionary. CompStat was revolutionary in its evolution in that the idea that police could do something about crime, did do something about crime, and the genesis of it was focusing not only just on crime but disorder and having a system to measure it and hold people accountable, CompStat. 21st century starts with what has been an incredible acceleration of the evolution and revolution in policing. For the first time, American police forces, all of them now had to focus some energy and attention on terrorism. Large cities like New York and LA focus huge amounts of resources. Over 1,500 detectives in New York. I had 300 in the much smaller LAPD. But most police departments had at least a detective that was going to be liaison, and we created all types of fusion centers to share information. Effectively, what we did was we CompStatted the terrorism problem around the country. Timely, accurate intelligence, sharing that information, and acting upon it before there was a threat. And in New York City, my predecessor, Ray Kelly, did a phenomenal job creating the counterterrorism capabilities in New York, and that over these last 24 years that we've had really minimum numbers of terrorist incidents, despite significant numbers of terrorist plots and intrigues against the city. But as we progress further into the 21st century, back in the 1990s, policing was pretty simple. It was the idea of crime and disorder. And in the 90s, we found a system to deal with it. And we also found a philosophy and style of policing going back to Sir Robert Peel's days and basically something that the Met had held on to throughout its history, which was the idea of community support. And we call it community policing in the United States. The concept of partnership, problem solving, involving the community, and the goal was the prevention of crime before it happened. So that basically helped us significantly in the 21st century with the expression, if you see something, say something, encouraging the partnership with the communities, because the feds, who had been principally charged with dealing with terrorism, no longer could with this worldwide problem. So what they needed to be assisted by was the 800,000 American police officers and the 300 million American citizens. And as we progress further into the 21st century, the challenges have exploded so that a police chief, a police commissioner, in your case, the commissioners of your departments, just think of the challenges they have to face in the 21st century. Not only terrorism, but the issues of technology, the whole idea of cybercrime, the whole idea of AI, and they're dealing it with, in many respects, fewer resources than they had back in the 1990s. So with smaller police resources, arguably equipped with much more technology, they are dealing with huge amounts of technology-driven crime, ransomware, ID theft, the whole social media network, and its encouragement of human trafficking, its encouragement of sexual deviation, that there's not a police force in the world that's able to keep up with it. And it's so ironic that finally in the 1990s, we learned what to do about crime, but then crime exploded, and it was almost like there was a nuclear explosion. And every passing year seems to create a new challenge, a new threat. And policing is being asked to address these threats with fewer resources. You've begun in your country to try to make up for the catastrophic reduction by 25%. And you're having great difficulty doing it because in your country, like mine, policing has fallen into a period of disrepute, that people no longer see it as a prestigious career choice. Might that change? I certainly hope so, but it's going to take a while. What's the old Gilbert and Sullivan song? A policeman's lot is not a happy one. Well, in the 2020s, it is certainly not a happy one, either in your country or in America.
But a common theme that I get from you throughout your career is almost this sort of common sense approach to policing, that the job of the police is to be out there amongst the public, to work in partnership, to not overcomplicate things, to look at systems that ultimately work. Here in the UK, and I don't know whether Rory would agree with me here, there's a high level of focus within our policing services of academia amongst senior ranks, that everybody's got to be incredibly smart to be able to run these organizations. And we get very much spun up in very complex issues in terms of a variety of different groups that seem to give those groups that shout the loudest the most attention, and sort of the rest of the community sort of gets left behind. You know, have you witnessed, or do you see the evolution of police chiefs moving away from sort of Peelian principles and the way that really you police with such great success?
Your comment is basically takes us back to Jack Maple. Jack Maple was basically had a high school education. He was not well educated by the current standards, and so what you need is a blending. You need some very smart people. You need people in policing. You need people from outside policing. I think in my leadership time, that's what I was able to create with the teams that I created. But what also is at my core, my being, is optimism that crises is opportunity. Crises is opportunity to create change, to accelerate change. And so crises, which are oftentimes seen as a negative, I try to find the positive. And so much of what we're talking about in the area of public safety is trying to have the public, the politicians, understand the importance of police to dealing with so many of these societal ills. I have an expression, a mantra, if you will, that I formed when I was chief of the LAPD. And that expression is cops count, police matter. The idea being the individual action of a single cop can have phenomenal impact, both good and bad. And the collective action of policing, similarly, can have significant impact, negative or positive. I look to the events of the murder of George Floyd. The actions of that one police officer set American policing back 20 years. set back 20 years of improving race relations, community relations. And so the idea is to, as much as possible, try to train your officers, supervise them, motivate them to the importance of the position, that their actions, that every day they have the opportunity to do something of significance. And so that at the end of their 20 or 30-year career, that they can look back and say, I had a life of significance. In my case, I look back on my 50 years and I really truly believe that I've had a life of significance, that my time as a cop counted, my time as a police leader has mattered. And I remain very much an optimist about the importance of policing and try to impart that in all of my organizations. So the idea that sometimes is such a thing as too much education, where you get, and this is why you really want to encourage the old expression, you want walk around leadership. You want leadership that doesn't get locked into the top floor of police headquarters. You need leadership that gets out there and walks the beat. Leadership gets out there and rides the trains. Leadership that gets out there and sits in one of those patrol cars. That you never want to remove yourself too far from the street. And I've seen that happen too often. That and the excuse is, well, the press of business. The idea that if I'm out there doing that, then all these issues at headquarters are going to suffer. Some respects, being a police chief is, we had a television variety show in the 1950s in America called The Ed Sullivan Show. And that show always ended seemingly with a juggler, somebody balancing on top of bamboo reeds, plates that are all spinning at the same time, and it's tossing a lot of balls in the air. That's policing today, that the average American police chief is dealing with that plate of crime, that plate of disorder, that plate of race relations, that plate of terrorism, that plate of cybercrime, that plate of technology. Any one of them is subject to crashing down at any moment. And his skill is running around and making sure they all keep spinning. It's quite a challenge.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I suppose one of the interesting things is the Scotland Yard as a brand is often seen sort of worldwide, but the Metropolitan Police, or the Met, I think the last probably few decades have actually been really tough for the Met. And I think, we go back to 2011, and obviously the sort of the riots and the serious disorder that we saw in London and elsewhere too. I suppose that's one kind of moment the Met had a real crisis. Another moment, obviously much more recently, was the sort of awful kidnap and murder of Sarah Everard by a then serving police officer, and then all the kind of gross misconduct and criminality that's flown since. So kind of the Met there with two huge kind of crisis moments. What sort of lessons might you have had for, had you been successful, had the law allowed you to become the commissioner, and had indeed that appointment been made? Kind of, do you have even now a sense as to what some of the issues were for the Met then, and perhaps more broadly what some of the issues are today for them?
Well, it goes back to my comment of out of crises comes opportunity. Out of the two most recent crises you discussed, that did come opportunity in the sense of appreciating and understanding, in the case of the officer accused of the kidnapping, rape, and murder, his background, in the sense of an individual who probably should never come onto the department in the first place. So improving the hiring standards, certainly improving the supervision standards, that, so that out of every incident that ever occurs is a learning opportunity. And it's the idea of being willing to learn, being willing to make mistakes or admit mistakes and go forward. And out of the riots that occurred a number of years ago, those significant riots that you had in your country, certainly many lessons were learned from that, both in terms of the training, equipping of the officers, but certainly the need to get a better understanding of the frustrations of those communities and policing tend to always be the match that is thrown on the kindling. There's so much kindling out there, certainly around issues of race and poverty. And because of the nature of our roles, that we are often the match that sets them aflame. So the idea is that basically, how do we effectively prevent that match from being thrown in the first place? And that's where the leadership, the training come into play. And something your government has come to recognize. I think that they did not recognize 15 years ago when they began those dramatic cuts in the middle of an understandable budget crisis, but understanding that the first obligation of government, the first obligation, first and foremost, is public safety. Without it, nothing else will exist. And in some respects, there was an abrogation of the recognition of that in your country, much the same as it happened in America in the 1970s. And we saw the results of it. We've also seen the results when you adequately fund it. And that was the case in the 1990s in America with a 1994 crime bill, 100,000 more cops. New York City, the turnaround in New York, despite the many ideas that I and many others brought to the table, CompStat, quality of life enforcement, could not have been done without the addition of 7,000 additional police officers. That's the reality of it. And that's what we're understanding in America today, that we need to replenish the ranks of police officers because there are not enough of us to deal with traditional crime and disorder, and certainly not enough of us to deal with the complexities of 21st century policing.
Behind every successful police officer, be male or female, is a family that provides them with the love and support of often overcoming the significant challenges and that opportunity to decompress, to vent, to express feelings. How important has your family been to you in your 5 decades of leading and championing law enforcement? Because they're often the unsung heroes because of the work that you do and the stuff that goes on behind the background. How influential have those people been in your life?
Well, oftentimes they've been the long suffering. I've been married 4 times, and several of those divorces were brought about because of the pressures of the work that I was performing. One of the good things about the 21st century is that there's become an increasing recognition of just what you're describing, the trauma that officers face, that despite all the TV shows and movies, the public just doesn't understand that what that creates, that constant drumbeat. We recognize it finally for our returning war veterans, the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder. There's been an increasing understanding and appreciation of the impact of our officers on them and their families. And so there's been more attention focused on watching for those early signs of trouble to prevent them from escalating, to give officers some breathing room. And because what the average officer faces each day, that whether it's a traffic accident with all the gore that's associated with that, some of the horrific murder scenes they face, the child sexual crimes that they're required to investigate, that there has to be an appreciation that they're human beings, and that the wear and tear on their mental well-being needs to be addressed, recognized, and taken care of. So there's that evolution I talked about of policing, that as we've moved forward, we've become much more understanding that officers are human and that they have the same frailties as everybody else. We don't bring them in from Mars. They're not Autobahns, that they're human beings, and that we need to understand their weaknesses as well as their strengths.
As we sort of wrap up, Commissioner Bratton, if you were to give 3 big tips or sort of your big takeaways as to what could make them the next future leaders, what's often the advice that you give out to your colleagues that you meet on your tours around America through various different police departments?
It's the idea of always be learning, ABL. There was a wonderful play a number of years ago, playing Gary Glenn Ross, about salesmen always be selling. Well, the police profession is always be learning. And our great weakness in your country and mine is we don't train our officers well enough, either as they're entering or during their careers. And so I referenced earlier the closing of Bramshill. Why? If anything, you know, the last place you'd want to close was that institution that basically we so envied in America, because in America, we have no generic training for American police chiefs. Most police chiefs really have no training to be a police chief. That's the reality of it. And in America, every police chief starts at the bottom as a cop coming into the profession and then moving their way up the top. We don't fly them in from elsewhere. We don't appoint civilians as heads of police organizations by and large. So the idea is to always be learning, police themselves, always be training, always be supervising, and always be monitoring. And on the part of the public, the idea of truly seeking to engage in partnership with the police. So the idea of, collaboration, the idea of community, that the police are not a separate community from the communities they police. They need to be a part of it. And that was a lesson, thank God, I learned in the very early stages of my career in the mid-1970s, when I was implementing one of the first community policing programs in American policing. And it has been a guiding roadmap for me ever since. And I think is significantly an attribute to the success I believe I've had in American policing.
Rory, before we close up, have you got any final words for Commissioner Bratton?
Kind of you had an influence on me. As I walked the beat in South London, I was motivated and had a strong sense that I did matter as a cop. I did matter. I did count, and I could make a difference. And I think it's something that we should all hold on to. And I salute you for everything you've done in that endeavor. And I hope that many of the newer officers that we're recruiting here will be able to discover that as well.
There are a few careers, Rory, as you can appreciate, that allow you to have that opportunity to have a life of significance and have it every day. That every day there's the opportunity to save a life, to impact positively on many lives, both of your colleagues as well as the public. And there's a lot of jobs that people choose, a lot of professions that they choose don't have that type of impact. That this idea that you can look back and say, I changed countless lives. That one of the things that we talk about in New York oftentimes is the turnaround of crime in the 1990s, when we were averaging over 2,000 murders a year. In New York, since our time in 1994, Maple, myself, Timothy, is average fewer than 500 murders a year. So if you take that 25-year period of time with 1,500 fewer murders every year, there's 30,000 lives that we can comfortably feel that we saved. 30,000 people who went on to hopefully live lives that were good lives, that because they were not the victim of a murder. So that's how I look at it, in the sense of all the lives that, in my case, New York City, 8 million people, Los Angeles, 4 million, the millions of people that through my actions with the police officers I've been privileged to work with, look at how we have profoundly impacted their lives. Doesn't get any better than that.
Well, Commissioner Bratton, from my part, it is certainly not lost on me the significance of being able to sit down in front of you and to hear some of your wisdom, your experiences, some of the successes, some of the challenges that you've faced through
some of the failures.
and the biggest takeaway from me is that a crisis is an opportunity for change, and the optimism that you bring to that is something that, for me, I think is incredibly refreshing. Probably something not a lot of police leaders think about in terms of when a crisis hits. It tends to be close the shutters, bury the head, and let's just see if we can get through this. So listen, I can't begin to imagine the amount of lives that you have touched throughout your 5 decades. On behalf of myself, Public Safety Foundation, which Rory established a couple of years ago now, which I'm proud to run with him. Thank you ever so much for giving us an hour of your time to look back at your policing history. And thank you for everything that you have done and continue to do for the policing family, not only in the US, but the impact that you've had on lives like Rory's here in the UK. Thank you ever so much.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the educational opportunities all my many experiences in your wonderful country and city have provided me over time. It's been a great ride, and thankfully it continues.
Thank you very much indeed, Commissioner Bratton.